What is it about Australia that makes almost 95% of the landmass empty? Almost everyone knows that Australia is a huge place in terms of land. But it's also a pretty small place in terms of population, but few people really understand the absolute scale of how sparsely populated the Australian continent actually is. Australia is around the same size as the bottom 48 states of the United States, which helps put the figures into perspective. Over 300 million people are living in these 48 U.S. states, compared to just over 26 million in Australia. Accordingly, the population of 2 U.S. states exceeds that of the whole continent of Australia. For instance, Texas has more than 28 million people, and California has more than 39 million. But have you ever wondered why a staggering 95% of this continent seems uninhabited? The desert. Everybody knows that Australia is covered in a big old desert with tons of super dangerous animals and insects. Who would ever want to actually live in such a country? Well, most of the problem comes from the fact that Australia is uniquely cursed when it comes to both a geologic and location perspective. It is located relatively close to Antarctica, the frozen continent. The western side of Australia is continuously battered by cold ocean currents coming up from the Southern Ocean, which means that there simply isn't enough heat to generate large-scale evaporation that's necessary to form rain clouds over much of the West. All of these factors converge to make Australia by far the driest inhabited continent on the Earth, with the least amount of average annual rainfall. According to the Map and Research, Australia's average rate of annual rainfall, where you can see most of the rain on the continent, falls on the east coast, which leaves the northern part of Australia even more difficult to live in. The problem in northern Australia is not just that it receives a low amount of rain on average, but that it receives that rain largely all at once and over ridiculously variable periods of time. Just like everywhere else in the tropics, northern Australia is dominated by the wet and the dry season, where rainfall is greater during the summer and less during the winter. But it's not just the erratic nature of the continent's rainfall that makes fresh water scarce here. It's also the lack of any decently large rivers. But as climate changes, it continues to worsen the effects of drought in the continent. These higher temperatures are rapidly increasing the rates of evaporation throughout the waters of the basin, making the water increasingly scarce, with some sections of the basin at times remaining completely dry for months. And it's not just the scarcity of fresh water on the continent that makes sustaining a very large population difficult. It's also the scarcity of good land for farming and agriculture, owing once again largely to geography, geology, and location. Well, if we are to look at Australia as a country and not a continent, Australia actually has a ton of freshwater resources. In fact, Australia has an estimated 492 cubic kilometers worth of renewable freshwater resources, which is more than a lot of countries with significantly higher populations. For example, that's twice as much as Pakistan, a country which has more than 8 times as many people. So it's not just about the lack of freshwater and arable lands that makes a very large part of Australia empty. In theory, Australia does have enough space and resources to support a lot more people than the 26 million who live there today. The big reason why it doesn't is that for pretty much the entire history of Australia right up until the present day, it's just been a really tough place for anyone to actually get to. For millions of years now, Australia has been effectively a lost continent, isolated from all the Earth's other major landmasses, drifting alone out in the sea. Australia is alone, and that's why it's empty. But despite all the odds that are stacked up against them, the country is actually one of the world's most major agricultural producers and exporters. The continent's ancient natural challenges like unpredictable rainfall, drying rivers, droughts, and vast arid wilderness, along with new challenges like the uncertain course of climate change, means that Australia has an epic battle against its own environment, and at the end of it to continue increasing its population. But the growth over the next 2 decades will not come without its challenges.